a lot of fear, resentment, misunderstandings, feelings of anger and sadness and worry and anxiety. It's not good. And it's all focused on sex. And the more time it goes on in this way, the worse it becomes, the harder it is to get out of those patterns. One person feels like dissatisfied and hopeless and rejected and invisible and not taken care of. And the other partner feels almost the same things with added anxiety and pressure about the sexual realm. So what do they do usually? They do one of a few things. One is like the person that wants more desire at some point says, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to stay away from you. Let's see how long it takes you to reach out to me. And nothing happens. Or they keep asking for it, saying, hey, I need this. We need to change this. What are we going to do about it? And nothing happens. Or they try to be perfect and do everything perfect and just be the best person ever, and nothing happens. The reality is the more they try to control this thing or control this person around sex, the worse it becomes. And none of these strategies work. And I'm going to be talking to you about what works. But before we do that, we need to understand how this couple got to this place. At one point, they were like all over each other, having sex all the time. What happened? What happens typically is that people get together, and at the beginning, they're basically high on drugs. You know, the new relationship energy is pretty intense, and you feel like you're on drugs, like you were walking on clouds, you know, like all those songs talk about. So the thing is that when you're in that state, you're doing things that you wouldn't do if you weren't high. You're like staying out all night, like having tons of sex, like having sex in the middle of the woods, or, you know, like suddenly going and flying off to Paris for a romantic, you're doing all kinds of stuff that maybe you wouldn't do if you weren't high. So that's what happens at the beginning. And so that's where people start off. These are the expectations going forward too. And what happens is people eventually move in together, and moving in together is just a different, you're no longer on vacation anymore. It is no longer, like a 24/7 party. Now we got to think about work. We got to think about paying bills. We got to think about taking care of family and all kinds of stuff that is not sexy. Like, it's not sexy to do the dishes. It's not sexy to worry about money. None of this is sexy, and it tires the person, especially one person over the other. It makes them anxious. They're trying to do too much, and so there's a lot of pressure coming from there, a lot of anxiety coming from there. So it is not a sexy place for that person. And what happens is that they have the type of desire, responsive desire, that shuts down when things aren't going well in the environment. Like when they're stressed and they're tired, they don't want to have sex. But then you have this other desire that's the spontaneous desire. Doesn't care what's happening around them, they still want to have sex. It could literally be bombing outside and they want to have sex. It's on all the time. It's consistently on. So what happens is one of the desires starts to diminish because they're stressed out, they're tired. It's like they're not feeling high anymore. Real life has set in. And so what happens is that in itself is not an issue, and neither is the issue of like not being bothered by context. The issue becomes when we start to interpret one person's lower sex drive as something personal, as something that is because we're not desirable or because they tricked us in some way. When in reality, what's happening to this responsive desire, but that, by the way, 50% of us have, and mostly women, to understand it that way suddenly changes the dynamic, because you're no longer as angry or as resentful, because it's not about you. It's about this person's desire that they have. You don't ask for which desire you're going to get. You just get it, and that's it. And of course, you can work around that. We're plastic human beings that can bend and move forward in all kinds of situations, but I'm just talking about basic inclinations. And so some people have responsive desire and some people have spontaneous desire, and to be able to understand that it's not a choice and we can't control what it needs in order to open up. And so the best way forward is to really understand more about this responsive desire that most of the time we don't know a lot of, because most of what we talk about and what we see is based on this more spontaneous desire. Before we go into what would work as far as this situation, how to handle these discrepancies in desire is what we call it, these differences in desire, because there's nothing innately wrong with having a lower sex drive or a higher sex drive. It's just that you're in some way dissatisfied with the situation. But before we do that, we need to understand what sexual desire is. If we're going to talk about something, we should probably know what we're talking about. And I'm sure there's lots of fancy definitions out there, but for me, sexual desire is about wanting sex. But let's deconstruct that a little bit. What does sex mean for me and many other people, sex can be anything from flirting to like endless possibilities when it comes to sex, and penetrative orgasmic relationship is somewhere in there. So you have many, many different ways to be sexual, and just in changing that changes some things, some pretty significant things, because no longer is there pressure for it to be about penetrative orgasmic sex. Now we have this other possibility, so it reduces the pressure and also the shame sometimes that comes along with when we can't have penetrative orgasmic sex. So that's what sex is. What is wanting? We all want things with different intensities, right? And why? I mean, there could be endless reasons of why we want especially sex with different intensities. But the reality is that there's all these different ways of wanting as far as quantity and as far as quality too. And so to understand like, oh, that this person, the way they want is different from mine. And again, it's nothing personal. It's just that's the way that they are, and that they can learn to communicate in different ways. So sexual desire is about wanting in different intensities, in different ways. Sex, many different choices there. But what influences the amount of sex we desire, that quantitative and like the investment in sex that we have? One thing that definitely influences our expectations around sexual desire and sex is our social constructs, our social organization, our social expectations, our social value systems. We are consistently bombarded with messages about what it takes to be a good human being, what is not a good human being. And we're obsessed with what would make us a good sexual partner, what would make us a good desirable sexual partner. And we spend a lot of money on being sexual. So not only do we have these social constructs that are telling us what's good and bad, they're in some way hinged with an economic system that is benefiting from us having a value system based on whether or not we're having sex and how good the sex is and how often the sex is. So there's that. Like, I'll desire sex a lot if I know my survival in the world depends on it. Like, if I can't survive socially, if I'm not having sex, because everybody's going to say, oh, you're a weirdo, you're not having sex, and maybe some people will stay away from me, or even, that might influence the way that I marry. And it's not so much that you think like, oh, if I don't reach these ideals about being sexually desired or having sex, that something bad will happen. Not really something bad is going to happen. It's an internal thing that happens. It's like, I can't do this. I can't reach this ideal that everybody around me is saying is the ideal. And then I feel shame. Of course I feel shame. Everybody else is doing it. What's the hell's wrong with me that I can't do it? So that creates this toxic cycle of shame, because we try again, because, we get down, we get hopeless. Like, I can't do this. A lot of shame. We move away maybe, and some people move faster, and then we move toward again, and we try again, and we try again, and we try again, and we don't succeed, and we don't succeed, and we don't succeed, because no one ever succeeds in attaining this thing that's going to make them valuable. There's always the need or the want for more of that, because that is what's giving you your sense of value. But if you have a sense of value that's coming from an internal place rather than an external place, you're not going to be on this treadmill of trying to get something over and over again and not being able to get it. So definitely, I'm going to want sex more depending on whether my sense of worthiness is dependent on it. And just think of both the identified male and identified female feel the pressures of these dominant discourses, these expectations of what makes us a worthy human being. A female will often be trying to reach this ideal of being the ideal sexually desired woman, which means different things from a male, for example. It definitely means different things as to the quantity of sex that a valuable female has. And so she is determined by these expectations and these social constructs, and her desire will be dependent on that, and maybe it may look very different than somebody that their value system is also dependent on how much sex they have. So that's just an example of how these things work out. Then how much we want sex is also determined by our psychology, like whether or not we're anxious or depressed, or whether or not we have had some trauma, whether or not we feel shame and disgust about ourselves. So all those and more emotional states can really affect how much sexual desire I want. Some people just are born like that. Like, some people want it less than others, and that's just the way it is. And finally, my favorite thing is that, desire in some way states, like, or wanting in some way, we're not going to want what we have every day, right? Like, we eat rice and beans every day. Do you think I want rice and beans when I'm in that wanting space? No, I want something different. And that's, like, that's the thing, is if you have this thing that, like if I like chocolate cake and the chocolate cake is following me around saying, eat me, eat me, eat me, I'm going to lose desire to eat it. So I think part of desire is also about not having something shoved down your throat, or having something be something that's unusual, or something that doesn't come often, or that in some way I have to work a little bit for it, that type of thing. Another thing to consider is what affects sexual desire. There are two different types of desire. One is spontaneous. That's on all the time. Doesn't matter what's happening. It could be bombing outside. That person wants to have sex. It doesn't turn off. It's consistent. It's on. Then we have the responsive desire that is definitely influenced by things such as being tired, or feeling anxious, or having too much to do, or being too much in your head, or that the world is on fire. Half the population has this responsive desire, and half the population is going to say, I don't want sex under these conditions. And especially when you have conflict in the relationship too, that will shut down desire for the responsive desire right away. And it's important to see that you have two different types of desire that work differently, so that you start to understand and make meaning in a different way. So now no longer is this person just doing it because they choose to do it, because they don't care, because they're just out to get you. No, because they can't change how their desire works, and that, it would be a good idea for both of you to come together to figure out, like, we have this piece that neither one of us understand what it needs in order to open up. And so to be able to engage in that process of figuring out, what does this responsive desire need to either get rid of the barriers or to encourage some play in that area. And the problem is not whether you have responsive desire or spontaneous desire. They're very different, but neither one is better than the other. They just are what they are. And so I think a very important step is to try to stop thinking that the other person's expression of sexuality is dysfunctional. Although I do understand that there are expressions of sexuality that are definitely dysfunctional. I'm just talking about kind of like without any of those like big red flags, then we can say that neither one or the other is better than the other. And that's super important, because there needs to be respect for each other before you can even come close to each other. But I can tell you straight out, the responsive desire, generally what it needs more than anything is emotional connection. That's what I've heard like 99% of the time. So, I mean, there's one person, I guess, or two that are different, but most people that have responsive desire need emotional connection to move forward. And so anything that you can do to increase emotional connection, which one of them might be to defocus from sex and to change some of the expectations and dynamics that are involved in this. Am I asexual? A lot of times people will ask me, is my partner asexual? I think they're asexual. I'm pretty sure they're asexual because they haven't wanted sex as much as they did before. And sometimes they don't want sex at all. So do you think they're asexual? And the answer is no. Actually, according to the asexual org, they actually have it very clear, as far as I could understand it. I may be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That asexual people would probably have wanted sex less than 3 times during their lifetime. That takes a lot of people out of the picture, including your partner. The person that wanted sex before but is now doesn't want sex is not asexual. And you may be thinking, well, maybe she doesn't know she's asexual. Maybe she's just making pretend. So it would suffice to ask, do you want sex more than 3 times during your lifetime? And if she says, yes, I do, then she's not asexual. But if she says she's asexual, regardless of how many times she wants sex or not, she's asexual. If she says she's not asexual, no matter how many times she wants sex or not, that is what she is. That is what we give people the right to choose how they identify. So if she's not asexual, then why does she avoid or is repulsed by sex? Or why has her desire gone down so much? So avoidance and repulsion of sex are a little bit different. Repulsion is a lot more intense and would probably involve some sort of trauma, either in the relationship or outside of the relationship. So if it's a repulsion, that would be probably a quicker trip to the therapy. Avoidance is a little bit less intense, and that's what we're going to focus on now. And even the repulsion, all these things affect it, but I would say trauma is basically probably part of the repulsion piece, and the avoidance piece, maybe yes, maybe no. People have lower desires. They could have lower desires because they've had bad experiences with sex and they don't want to repeat them, or that sex is painful, or that something happens in sex that's really hard for them. They don't want to repeat that, and so that's important. Why would anybody want to repeat something that is either, really bad or traumatic. The person is fearful of wanting sex, fearful of having sex, fearful of not having sex, fearful of all of it, because what their experience has been is that talking about sex leads us to conflict. Sex is a conflictual place, and I'm really scared about what's going to happen. But this is number one, is the pressure to have sex. That we've talked a little bit about it today, but when that person is having sex when they don't want to, over and over again, because everybody does it every once in a while, but over and over again, over a long period of time, it decreases your desire. And then sometimes it eliminates the desire. So that's a super important thing to address right away. And all of these things I talk more in depth in other videos. So you just have to either I leave a link or you can find them on my YouTube channel. If you've got any mental health issues going on, like you're anxious, more anxious or depressed than usual, that's going to affect your sexual desire. If the relationship is conflictual or disrespectful or abusive, anything toxic is going to affect your sexual desire. You're not going to want to have sexual desire with somebody that's being a dick to you. It's just not going to happen. The other reason is you feel incompetent. Like, that's a scary area. I don't do well in that area. That area leads to me feeling like I can't do things right. I get criticized, or I just feel paralyzed from the fact that I don't know what I'm doing. I feel so incompetent. The other thing people fear is like some things that result from sex, like getting pregnant or getting STDs or getting happy was one that I heard the other day. I think that I don't want to have sex with you because I don't want to be too happy. That's going to make me work less. And that I respect that. Body image issues. You have sex with your body. So if you're not feeling great about your body and sometimes repulsed by your body, you're not going to be like, oh, let me just like take all my clothes off and have a party. It's how unlikely is that going to happen? That's not going to happen. And then, finally, they just don't want it as much. There doesn't have to be a reason. It is what it is. And then we have to talk about like, well, what do we do with the situation? But the whole process is to figure out like, what is your sexual desire? Because up until now, you probably don't know, because there's been so many dynamics kind of getting in the way. So what is it that you do want? Once we figure out like organically, who are you sexually? Then we figure out like, well, is this going to work or not? So what can you do to move this along, to start healing this dynamic that you've created? One is to stop labeling each other as dysfunctional. Stop understanding each other's preferences or ways of being as a personal attack or as a choice. And also, like, in the end, some people, they don't work out. Some of these things are just we're not compatible. But right now, you don't even know whether you're compatible or not, because there's so many things shutting down one person as to what they want and what they need. They don't have any voice there that you don't know. But once you know, then you can have a conversation like, is this going to work given the reality? And some of the things we talked about today, things that affect the person with low desire, like feeling pressured. If you have any control over that, like you actually pressure, or you get moody, or you get angry when you don't get sex, or you like push her to have sex, or you don't notice when she doesn't want to have sex, all these type of things that are a little bit pressure inducing, you can stop those. That's a straight, very concrete thing that you can do, that you have total control over, and that might help things. And to be able to say, hey, by the way, I realize all these things, and I really don't want to have sex with you. If you feel pressured or you feel anxious, I want us to have sex that comes from a happier place. So let's work on this. I'm totally willing to take a step back and become more zen about sex, and not, have to pursue you all the time, and also anything else that needs to happen, but also stay engaged with you and tell you you're beautiful and that I love you and all kinds of other things. And then there are things that I go through in other videos that just purely behavioral and kind of fun, like scheduling fun and not sex, making sure you have a date night every week, and that date night should be a representation of your first date every single time, to keep things fresh and to keep that person feeling like, oh, you're actually making an effort here, and you're showing up in a way that tells me that, you're trying to get me to come closer to you, and vice versa. I don't want to get close to somebody that, first of all, we don't go out on a date, we don't have any fun, and then, when we're close to each other, you're dissociated, or you're on your phone too much, or you're angry. And that doesn't help. On top of that, maybe we go out once in a while, we go out in our sweatpants and we don't even look good and we don't even think about that stuff. And so all those types of things are easily addressed. And then another thing is to start to express when you are in like with each other, not love, like is a little bit different. So when you feel that little pull, that little attraction, and it doesn't have to be sexual, just of anything, to be able to say, wow, you're really sexy when you do the dishes, for example. And then he's going to do the dishes a lot. or she. The other thing you can do too, because with all of this, you have to communicate. If you're a couple that doesn't communicate well, you got to figure out how to have better tools to communicate, especially around these issues, because they're issues full of pain and wounding. And so if you don't have some really good skills, communication skills, that's not going to go well. That's a really hard place to communicate in, but it's necessary in order to feel connected and to feel like resolve things quicker and easier. And the other really important thing is to start to feel agency around your sexuality, to be able to say, hey, I kind of like this, I don't like this, maybe yes, maybe no, I'm not really feeling it, and feeling okay doing that. Feeling okay saying no, feeling okay saying, listen, I'd rather do this than that. Or even better, like, hey, how about if we do this? Or how about if, approach, you're the one leading the conversation or the action. So all those things are super important, because up until now, with the whole dynamic of the fear and the toxicity, there's a loss of agency usually. And so to gain that agency back is crucial. If you're interested in any more in-depth topics about the things that I mentioned, especially the interventions on how to do certain things, I'm going to link the videos below.